Mad dog. Apologize, now. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut clean through the room the way certain sentences do, not with volume but with weight. I watched the glass freeze halfway to Mark's mouth. His eyes found mine, and what I saw in them wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The slow, reluctant kind. Then he laughed. Not nervously, not politely, just that short, dismissive exhale men use when they've already decided something isn't worth their time. Come on, Uncle Frank, he said. It's just a nickname. That's when I knew the evening had already ended. Not the dinner, not the conversation, something quieter than both. An hour earlier, I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside the house in Fairfax, engine running longer than it should have, watching the neighborhood through the windshield. Late 80s colonials, trimmed hedges, American flags catching the early autumn breeze, the kind of street where people wave from driveways and know each other's trash day. Normal, that word had always felt borrowed to me, like something I'd checked out from a library I didn't quite belong to. I checked the mirror, hair pulled back, light makeup I'd had to relearn how to apply, a navy blouse that didn't sit quite right on a body built for other things. No rank, no gear, no uniform, just a woman going to dinner. I cut the engine, just dinner. I told myself I'd handled worse. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken, garlic, and something sweet baking low in the oven. Warm light, voices threading over each other, silverware on plates, somebody laughing too loud from the kitchen, the laugh of someone who hasn't had to be careful with their voice. Jenna found me first. Evie, you made it. She crossed the room before I'd taken 2 steps and pulled me into a hug. I held still a beat longer than most people would, then returned it. Old habit. I'd gotten better at it. Wouldn't miss it, I said. That wasn't entirely true, but Jenna didn't need to know that. She steered me through the living room, cousins, in-laws, a neighbor who'd been coming to holidays for so long no one questioned it anymore. Names that slipped through immediately. Smiles that lingered a half-second too long, the way people's do when they can't figure out exactly what they're looking at. Not because they knew me, because they didn't. And something about the gap made them curious. Mark was leaning against the doorframe between the living room and dining area, arms folded, already mid-conversation with someone about golf or real estate or something built for comfortable rooms. He had that ease some men carry without earning it, the effortless confidence that comes from never having had to be anything else. When Jenna introduced us, he looked me over, not rude, just measuring. So you're Evie, not a question. Heard you were Navy. Was, I said. Retired already, he raised an eyebrow. You don't look that old. I'm not. A chuckle, must have been a desk job then. I didn't answer. Silence is a tool. Most people rush to fill it, and whatever they pour in tells you everything. Mark just shrugged and turned back to his conversation, like he'd already sorted me into a folder and moved on. That was fine. Most people think they have. We sat for dinner around 6. Long table, white plates, cloth napkins folded sharp. Someone had put in the effort to make it feel like an occasion, and that kind of care is its own quiet language. I took a seat near the middle, not commanding, not retreating, neutral ground. Across from me sat a man I hadn't met yet. Late 70s, maybe 80, posture straight without being rigid. Clear eyes that moved slowly and didn't miss much. Hands that stayed steady on the table. He didn't speak for a while, just watched, not suspiciously, but with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that first impressions cost less than wrong ones. Conversation flowed easily at first. Weather, traffic, the upcoming wedding, stories about how Mark and Jenna met, retold for the relatives who liked hearing them again. I did more listening than talking. Out there, silence kept you alive. In here, it just made people think you were shy. But then the conversation shifted, the way it always does, from general to personal. So Evie, someone partway down the table, what exactly did you do in the Navy? A simple question. I took a sip of water. Special operations. That phrase usually ends it. Not because people understand, because they don't. And most people over a certain age know when not to push on something they can't see the bottom of. But Mark leaned forward, elbows on the tablecloth. Special operations. He said it like he was weighing it. What does that actually mean? Various assignments, I said. He smiled at that. Sounds classified. Some of it is. Polite laughter scattered around the table. Mark didn't join in. He tilted his head, watching me the way someone does when they've decided some things. A puzzle worth solving. So you're in the Navy, he said. I nodded once. What's your nickname? The room didn't go silent right away. There's always a moment, that small, fragile gap where things could still go either way. I could have deflected. I could have laughed it off and let him have his dinner table story. I could have been the version of myself that makes other people comfortable. But I didn't. I looked at him steadily. Mad Dog. A few people laughed light, uncertain, like they weren't sure if we were performing something together. Then I caught the man across from me, the quiet one. His glass had stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes didn't leave mine. And just like that, everything shifted. Apologize now. His voice was low, but carried clean to every corner of the room. Every thread of conversation dropped. Mark blinked. Excuse me. You heard me. The old man set down his glass with deliberate care. Apologize. Mark looked around the table, searching for backup that wasn't there. Uncle Frank, come on, I asked her a question. No, Frank said quietly, you didn't. Nobody reached for a fork after that. The roast chicken cooled on its platter. The green beans sat in their dish, the toasted almonds still glistening. From the kitchen, a timer went off, kept beeping, until Jenna pushed back her chair and disappeared to silence it. Even that small, ordinary sound felt strange inside the quiet. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I've lived through gunfire, rotor wash, radio chatter so loud it rattled the fillings in my teeth. But I've learned that some of the heaviest moments in life happen in rooms where nobody says anything at all. Mark looked from Frank to me, then back. Okay, what did I miss? He tried to laugh, but the laughter had thinned out. Seriously, did I miss something? Frank finally set his glass down. Carefully. His face had gone still in a way I recognized, the stillness of a man whose memory had taken hold of him. You asked her like it was a joke, he said. It was a question. It was a challenge. Frank's voice didn't rise, it didn't need to, there's a difference. Every eye at the table shifted between them. Jenna came back from the kitchen, read the room in a single glance, and stopped in the doorway. What happened? Mark spread his hands. Apparently I committed some kind of crime by asking what her nickname is. Sister-in-law, Jenna corrected automatically, then turned to me. Evie. I'm all right, I said. And I was, on the surface. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't angry. I was tired in that deep, familiar way that has nothing to do with sleep. The thing about a nickname is that most people think they're entitled to it. They imagine it as a trophy, something colorful, something fun, a little badge you wear so others can feel close to danger without ever having to stand in it. But some names are receipts, proof of what something cost. Frank drew a slow breath and looked directly at me for the first time since he'd spoken. Did I hear you right? You did, I said. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, and I watched something register in his face, not excitement, not admiration, recognition, the kind that doesn't make a room bigger, the kind that makes it smaller. My mother used to say that older Americans carry history differently, not louder, deeper. They know what it means when a name goes still in a room. Frank was that kind of man. Mark was not. He sat back with a small shrug. Okay, somebody help me out here because now I'm curious. That's part of your problem, Frank said. The words were plain, they landed heavy anyway. Jenna winced. Uncle Frank, she said carefully, maybe we all just. I am calm. And he was. That was the unsettling part. He wasn't angry in the hot-blooded way. He was angry the way some old men get when they've seen enough life to know the exact weight of disrespect. Across the table, Aunt Louise cleared her throat softly. Frank, do you know Evie from somewhere? Not personally, he shook his head, then he looked at me again. But I know the name. My shoulders tightened. I kept my face neutral. You train your body long enough, the habit stays long after the need. Mark caught that sentence and reached for it like a lifeline. Oh, come on, what is this? Some kind of ghost story from the Pentagon? Nobody laughed. That was the moment his face changed. Not dramatically, just a slight dimming. The first pale edge of understanding that he was the only one at the table treating this as entertainment. Frank folded his napkin and placed it deliberately beside his plate. I served in Vietnam, he said. Different Navy, different century. But I stayed connected to enough people over the years to know when a name is spoken with caution. I looked at my water glass. There are moments when you want to disappear, and people always assume it's shame. It's usually the opposite. Once a room starts looking at you a certain way, they stop seeing the ordinary parts. They stop seeing the woman who forgot to bring the pie server she promised, or who sat in her car for 10 minutes gathering nerve to walk through a door. They start seeing a story. And stories are dangerous things, once they stop belonging to you. I heard that name years ago, Frank went on. Not from the news, not from television, in conversations where people didn't use names lightly. You're making this sound ridiculous, Mark said. Am I? Mark opened his mouth, closed it. Jenna sat down slowly, not eating, not touching her wine. Evie, she said, softer now, is this real, the nickname? Yes. Her brow furrowed. Why have you never mentioned it? I gave a tired smile. Because this is dinner, Jenna, not a deposition. A few uneasy smiles moved around the table. Not laughter, relief. The small relief of recognizing that normal rhythm still existed. But Mark wasn't ready to let it settle. So what, I'm supposed to apologize because she has a tough-sounding nickname from work. I turned to him then, fully, enough that he had no choice but to meet my eyes. You don't owe me I said. You owe people respect before you decide they're lying. Silence. I hadn't raised my voice. At my age, after my life, I've learned that a steady tone can shame a person far more effectively than a shout ever could. Frank nodded once, almost to himself. That's right, he said, and for what it's worth, some names aren't bragging, they're warning labels. The room went quiet again, not frozen, just listening. Outside, headlights swept across the front window, a neighbor pulling into their driveway. Somewhere upstairs, a toilet flushed. Real life kept moving, which somehow made everything feel more grounded, not less. That's how these moments happen in America. Not on a battlefield, not in a film. At a polished dining table in Northern Virginia, beside a bowl of mashed potatoes and a half-finished basket of rolls. Mark stared at his plate for a long time before speaking. I wasn't trying to insult you, he said quietly. I believe that, I said. He looked up, surprised. But not trying and not doing are two different things. That reached him in a way Frank's sharpness hadn't. Pride doesn't usually shatter all at once. It gives a little first, then a little more. Frank leaned back, something in his expression easing by a fraction. You asked her to perform, he said. That's what you did. And some people have paid a very high price to do that for the amusement of a dinner table. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Aunt Louise reached for the green beans and quietly passed them to Jenna, as though mercy could begin with something as simple as resuming a meal. It almost worked. But Mark looked at Frank and asked the question that kept the whole thing from settling. How do you know that name? Frank didn't answer right away. At his age, silence isn't hesitation, it's judgment. He was deciding what belonged in that room, and that alone told me everything about him. Most people, the moment they think they know something unusual, rush to display it. Frank understood that information has weight. I saved him the trouble. You don't have to explain it, I said. His eyes stayed on mine. Maybe not, but maybe I should. Mark exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh, more the sound of patience wearing thin. This is unbelievable. Very believable, Frank said. That's the problem. The table had become one of those strange family traps, everyone caught between politeness and truth. Jenna looked like she wanted to smooth everything over with dessert, and a subject change. Aunt Louise kept folding and unfolding her napkin. Someone at the far end of the table took a sip of water just to have something to do with their hands. Frank rested his forearms on the table. 30 years after Vietnam, I worked around veterans organizations, military charities, a few federal contractors. You hear things, not gossip, just enough to know which stories carry weight. He paused. Every now and then a name came up, never in detail, just shorthand among people who understood what it meant when a mission went wrong and somebody still brought everyone home. My jaw tightened. I hated hearing it framed that way, not because it was wrong, because it was incomplete. People want clean versions of ugly things, especially at dinner. Evie, Jenna said softly, is any of that true? Some of it, I said. Mark jumped on that, some of it. Enough, Frank said. Mark crossed his arms, the same posture he'd worn when I arrived, but fitting him differently now. Less confidence, more defense. I'm sorry, he said, though the apology hadn't landed in his voice yet. I just have a hard time with this. She comes to dinner, barely says 10 words, and suddenly everyone's acting like she's some kind of secret war hero. I didn't ask anyone to do that, I said. No, he said, but you could clear it up. That was the first honest thing he'd said all night. He didn't want drama. He wanted certainty. People his age still believe certainty is something they're owed. Older people have usually lived long enough to understand that truth arrives in jagged pieces, and you either respect the edges or you get cut. Frank spoke before I could. You want her to satisfy your curiosity, that's not the same as clearing anything up. Mark's face reddened. I want to know if we're all being played. That landed harder than he meant it to. I could see it in Jenna's face when she closed her eyes. I should have been angry. Maybe 10 years ago I would have been. But anger takes energy, and by 35 I'd spent too much of mine on things that mattered more. I'm not playing anything, I said, and I'm not interested in convincing you. He stared at me more frustrated somehow than if I'd snapped back. Then why say it, mad dog, why not just brush it off? Because you asked. Frank gave the smallest nod, as though that answer was exactly what he'd expected. A younger cousin at the far end of the table, Caleb, 20s, cleared his throat. Was it like Afghanistan or something? I looked at him. He had that expression young people sometimes wear around military stories, half respectful, half shaped by movies and headlines. He wasn't mocking, just unsteady. Overseas, I said. That narrows it down, Mark muttered. Frank turned on him with quiet force. Would you listen to yourself? I'm asking questions. No, you're trying to win. That took the air out of him. It also settled something in me. Frank wasn't defending a myth. He was defending the principle that some people had earned the right not to be prodded for sport. Jenna looked between us. Evie, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew you served. I knew it was serious, but I didn't. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. Why? I glanced down at my plate. My food had gone cold without my noticing. Because when you tell civilians too much, I said, they either turn it into a movie or they back away from you in church parking lots. Nobody had a response to that. In a room full of family, that may have been the loneliest sentence I'd spoken in years. Frank broke the silence. There was talk of a rescue operation, he said carefully. That's all I ever heard. A bad situation, bad enough that people who knew better went quiet when the name came up. Mark's jaw tightened. There's no proof of any of this. I looked at him steadily. You need proof because you still think this is about status. He opened his mouth. It's not, I said. That nickname wasn't something I chose. It wasn't a trophy. It was what people started calling me after a mission that cost too much. The room didn't react dramatically. No gasps, no dropped silverware. Just a stillness, the kind that comes when everyone in a room realizes at exactly the same moment that this stopped being fun a while ago. Frank's voice dropped. That's what I figured. Mark looked at me for a long moment. And for the first time all evening, the smug edge in his expression was simply gone. What replaced it was more human and less flattering. Embarrassment. And underneath that, something closer to fear. Not fear of me, fear of having waded into deep water thinking it was shallow. Jenna put her hand on his wrist. He didn't look at her, he kept looking at me. I didn't know, he said. I believed him. That didn't repair the damage, but it mattered. Most family wounds don't begin with cruelty, they begin with carelessness. Frank leaned back slowly. Then now you do. And with that, the entire table seemed to understand that the evening had crossed a line it wouldn't uncross. Not into spectacle, into truth. Mark swallowed, his voice came out quieter. What happened on that mission? I looked down at my hands. I hadn't planned on telling any of them, but some nights choose their own direction. I didn't answer right away. There are questions that sound simple but aren't. Questions that pull on threads you've spent years tucking in at the edges. You don't refuse them because you're hiding something. You hesitate because once you start pulling, you can't always control how much unravels. And once it's out, it doesn't belong to you anymore. The room waited. I could feel it, not pressure, exactly. More like the held breath of people who'd finally stopped talking long enough to listen. I rested my hands flat on the table. It wasn't one moment, I said. It never is. Mark didn't interrupt. That alone told me something had changed. It started the way most operations do, I went on. Intelligence came in. Incomplete, time-sensitive. There were civilians involved, Americans. Contractors, aid workers, wrong place, wrong time. Caleb leaned forward slightly, but said nothing. We were told it was a recovery mission, I said. In and out, fast, controlled. A quiet breath. That's what it was supposed to be. Jenna's finned. Our wrist tightened around her napkin. What happened? I looked at her rather than Mark. We got there, I said, and it wasn't what we were told. That sentence hung in the air longer than I expected. Frank gave a small, knowing nod. The layout was wrong. The number of people inside was wrong. The level of resistance, wrong. I paused. You plan for variables. But there's a difference between variables and being sent into something you weren't prepared for. Mark's eyes were fixed on me now. Was it an ambush? Not exactly, I said, but close enough that the distinction didn't matter. I could feel the memory pulling sharper, the sounds, the heat, the way time stretches and compresses simultaneously when your body is running on adrenaline and training and nothing else. We went in anyway, I said, because that's the job. You don't stand outside and argue with bad intelligence while people are waiting inside. No one moved. We made contact, fast, loud, disorienting. In those moments you don't see clearly, you see shapes, movement, voices that don't always resolve into meaning. You rely on training, on the person beside you. I slowed. And when something goes wrong, you feel it before you understand it. Jenna's voice came out barely above a whisper. What do you mean? It means someone doesn't answer when they should, I said. A position that was supposed to be covered isn't. You realize in a fraction of a second that the plan you had is gone. Frank's eyes dropped briefly. He didn't need the explanation filled in. Did you lose people? Mark asked. Yes. I didn't soften it. Some things you don't dress up. The room shrank around that word. Aunt Louise whispered something under her breath. The first attempt failed, I continued. Not because I wanted to, but because stopping there would have left the story half told, which is its own kind of dishonesty. We had to pull back. Mark frowned. You left. We were compromised, I said, injured, outnumbered. And the hostages. I held his gaze. We left them there. Silence, not uncomfortable, just heavy and real. Caleb spoke before he could stop himself, but you went back. I looked at him, yes. Frank's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. He already knew that part. You went back alone, Mark asked. I didn't answer immediately, because that's always the part people reach for, not the failure, not the cost, just the decision that came after, as though that one choice existed in a clean vacuum, divorced from everything that surrounded it. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, I said. Nobody plans to go back alone. That's not how it works. Then how did it happen? I took a breath. because leaving them didn't sit right. That was the simplest version, the truest one. There are moments, I said, when you can follow orders and still know you'll carry something for the rest of your life. And there are other moments, rarer ones, when you step outside of that and accept a different kind of consequence. Mark stared at me. You disobeyed orders. Yes. No apology in it. Jenna looked stricken. Evie. I knew what I was doing, I said, and I knew what it could cost, not just professionally. Frank spoke quietly, but you went anyway. Yes. Nobody asked why again. They didn't need to. I leaned back slightly. It wasn't heroic, I said. It wasn't clean, it was loud and messy and deeply uncertain. The only reason I'm sitting here talking about it is because it worked. A pause. Not perfectly, nothing like that ever is. Mark's voice came out low. You got them out. Yes. And that's why they called you, he stopped. I shook my head slightly. That's why they called me that, I said, because I didn't stop. Frank closed his eyes for just a moment, not in admiration. In understanding. That's not something people say lightly, he murmured. No, I said, it's not. The room had changed completely. Nobody was leaning back casually anymore. Nobody was smiling the comfortable, performative smile of people navigating a social obligation. The safe distance that keeps conversations easy, the distance that lets you listen without having to actually hear, was gone. Now we were all sitting in something closer, harder, more real. Mark ran a hand over his face. I thought, he began, then stopped. What? I asked. He met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd walked in, there was no performance in his expression. I thought you were exaggerating. I know. That surprised him. You do. Yes. Why didn't you say something? I gave a small, tired smile. People don't hear things until they're ready to. Frank nodded once. That's true. Jenna reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of mine, uncertain. Evie, I'm sorry. For what? For not knowing, for all of this. I shook my head. You weren't supposed to know. That hadn't changed, but something else had. The room wasn't judging anymore. It was listening. And Mark wasn't ying to win anymore. He was trying to understand. That was a start, but we weren't finished yet, because understanding what happened is one thing, understanding what it cost is something else entirely. Nobody spoke for a while. You could feel the weight of it settling into the room like dust after something breaks. Not chaotic, just different, denser. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. It grounded me, brought me back to the table, to the people sitting there, to the fact that this wasn't a debrief or a report destined for a filing cabinet. This was family, or something trying to become it. Mark cleared his throat. So you just decided to go back? No challenge left in his voice, just quiet disbelief. I didn't decide it the way you're imagining, I said. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a realization. What kind? That I wasn't done. He frowned, but you said the mission failed. It did. And you were ordered to pull out. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Then how do you justify going back? I looked at him carefully. I don't. That stopped him. I don't justify it, I said again. I live with it. That's the part people never expect, the clean answer, the reason that makes everything line up neatly. But life doesn't work that way. Not at 35, not after enough years of watching how decisions ripple outward. Frank spoke quietly. There's a difference between justification and responsibility. Exactly. Mark absorbed that. So you went back knowing you might not come out. Yes. Why? I held his gaze, because they wouldn't. That landed differently from anything else I'd said. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just final, the kind of sentence that closes a door. Jenna blinked. Aunt Louise reached for her hand under the table. Mark looked down at his plate, then back up. He stopped, searched. I've never had to make a decision like that. No, I said gently, most people don't. Frank let out a long breath, and that is something to be grateful for. Mark nodded faintly. I think I treated it like a story, he admitted. Something you'd tell at a bar, something exciting to pass around. That's how it looks from the outside, I said. And from the inside. I paused. From the inside, it's mostly waiting, and hoping the person next to you makes it through the next 10 seconds. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. I hadn't noticed it before. Mark rubbed his hands together. I shouldn't have pushed you like that, at the start. No, I said. He winced slightly at how direct that landed. Then I softened it, just a little. But you didn't know what you were pushing on. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, I agreed, but it makes it understandable. That seemed to matter to him. People his age still live in that space where they want to be right, but they're beginning to understand that being decent has more lasting value. Frank looked at him evenly. What matters is what you do with it now. Mark nodded slowly, then he looked at me. I'm sorry. This time it arrived differently. No hedge to it, no performance, just a man admitting plainly that he'd misjudged someone sitting across from him. I studied him for a moment. Thank you. That was enough. Reconciliation, I've learned, doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly, in small sentences that people mean. Jenna exhaled as though she'd been holding her breath for the past hour. Okay, she said, forcing a small, fragile smile. Can we maybe eat before everything goes completely cold? Soft, uncertain laughter moved around the table. It wasn't a return to normal, but it was a step towards something livable. Plates were passed again. Someone poured more water. The ordinary rhythm of dinner resumed, more gently now, as though everyone had been reminded how easily things can break. Mark reached for the nearest dish and passed it to me without a word. A small thing, a real one. Thanks, I said. He nodded. Across the table, Caleb asked Frank a quiet question about Vietnam, and for the first time that evening, the room's attention moved away from me. I was grateful for that, not because I wanted to hide, because I wanted to be part of the room again, not the center of it. Frank answered slowly, choosing each word with care. No embellishment, no drama, just dates, places, and the particular kind of detail that matters more the older you get. I listened closely. There's a language veterans share across generations, not words exactly, but the manner in which certain things are left unsaid. The way a sentence stops just before the part that can't be explained. Jenna eventually stood to clear plates. I'll get dessert started. I'll help, I said. She shook her head. You stay, you've done enough for one night. The warmth in her voice was different from before, quieter, more considered. I sat back down. Mark watched her disappear into the kitchen, then looked at me. Hey, B. Airily above a murmur. I turned toward him. I meant what I said, he told me. I know. He nodded, then added, I think I've spent a lot of my life deciding I understood people in the first 5 minutes. I gave a faint smile. That's most people. Yeah, a beat, but I was wrong tonight. There wasn't much to say to that, so I just said, that happens. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh but gentler. Not like this. Frank glanced over at us from across the table. Not interrupting. Just present. He had the look of someone who'd witnessed this kind of moment before, the small, private turning points that don't make it into any story, but that change things anyway. Mark leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something else? You've been doing that all night, I said. He caught the humor in it and smiled, the first real smile of the evening. This one's different. I nodded, go ahead. He kept his voice low. How do you come back from that? He didn't mean the mission. He meant the life that comes after. I took a moment. You don't come back the same. Then what do? You build something new, I said. Piece by piece, you figure out what still fits and what doesn't. That sounds hard. It is. Frank spoke from across the table, but it's also necessary. Mark looked at him, then back at me. Do people help? I thought about that honestly. Some do, I said, some don't know how. And tonight, he asked. I met his eyes. Tonight helped. Something in his expression shifted, settling somehow. He sat back and held that thought. Jenna returned with apple pie, still warm, and small bowls of vanilla ice cream. The smell filled the room immediately, cutting through the heaviness in a way that felt almost deliberate. I think we've all earned this, she said. A few soft laughs moved around the table. Plates were passed again. This time the conversation came more naturally, not forced, not overly careful, just respectful. Aunt Louise asked me where I was living now. Caleb talked about his job. Someone mentioned the wedding, and this time it didn't feel like a distraction. It felt like what it was, a reminder that life keeps moving forward, even through the difficult evenings. I answered when spoken to, listened when others shared. Slowly, I stopped feeling like something the room was circling. After dessert, I stood. I'm going to step outside for a minute. Jenna looked at me. Everything okay? Yeah, I said, just need some air. Take your time. The night was cool and quiet. A soft breeze in the trees, distant traffic, the kind of dark that settles over suburban streets late in the evening when the last few lights in windows are the only sign that anyone's still awake. I rested my hands on the porch railing and just stood there. This is the part people don't talk about. Not the mission, not the aftermath, the in-between, the moments when you stand very still and try to feel like you belong somewhere that doesn't require you to be anything other than human. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn, I already knew. Frank stepped out and stood beside me. He didn't speak right away. He just looked out at the quiet street the way men his age sometimes do, not searching for anything, just present. After a while he said, "You handled that well." I didn't handle it, I said. It just happened. He nodded slightly. That's usually how it goes. We stood in silence. Then, coming home isn't easy. No, I agreed. Never was, he said. Different wars, same problem. I glanced at him. You still feel it. A faint smile, some days more than others. I understood that without needing it explained. He looked at me then, but nights like this help. I considered that. Yeah, I said, they do. He nodded once, then he said the thing that stayed with me longest. People don't need to understand everything, he said. They just need to be willing to respect what they don't. I let that settle. That's enough. Yes, he said, it is. We stood a little longer, not talking, not needing to. Inside, I could hear voices again. Softer, warmer, the ordinary music of a family winding down an evening. For the first time in a long while, that felt like something worth staying for. Morning came quietly. I woke in the guest room in that particular stillness of someone else's house. No alarms, no engines, just sunlight pressing through the blinds and the faint sound of movement downstairs. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then it came back. The dinner, the silence, Frank's voice cutting through the room, Mark's face the moment he understood, the way everything shifted and kept shifting until we'd arrived somewhere none of us had expected to be. I got dressed and went downstairs. The house smelled like coffee. Jenna was at the stove, mug in hand. She turned when she heard me. Good morning. Mornings. Sleep okay? Better than I expected, I said. She nodded like she understood that car. Why'd more wait than it might seem? I made coffee, there's breakfast if you want. Coffee sounds good. I poured myself a cup and leaned lightly against the counter. We shared the quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then she said, last night, and stopped, started again. I'm really glad you stayed. So am I said. I hope it didn't feel like we were putting you on display. It didn't, I said, not entirely true at first, but by the end, something had changed. I think we all learned something, she said. I gave a small nod. Yeah. Mark came in then, slower than usual, like a man who'd been thinking before he got out of bed. He looked at me, then Jenna, then back at me. Mornings. Mornings. He poured his coffee and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then, I've been thinking about what you said. Which part? All of it, he said, but mostly the part about not bringing that name to dinner. That one tends to stick. He nodded. It should. A pause. I talked to Uncle Frank this morning. What did he say? That I was lucky. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Lucky I learned that lesson at a dinner table, he said, and not somewhere it would have cost me more. That was exactly the kind of thing Frank would say. Mark set his cup down. I meant what I said last night, about being wrong. I know. He looked at me directly. I don't think I've ever really thought about what people carry, not like that. That's most people. A faint smile. Yeah, but I'd like to be better about it. That was the difference, not perfection, willingness. That's enough, I said. Jenna watched the exchange quietly, her expression soft. Do you two want breakfast? Sure, Mark said. Yeah, I said. Later, we sat at the same table. Same chairs, same light coming through the same windows, but it felt different. Settled, not tense or fragile, just real. The conversation came more easily. Mark asked where I was thinking of going next, and this time it was just curiosity, the kind without an edge. I told him I was thinking of staying in Virginia for a while, maybe working with a veterans support group, maybe something quieter. That sounds like you, Jenna said. I smiled faintly. I think it might be. Frank joined us halfway through breakfast, moving a little slower than the night before but just as steady. He took his seat, looked around the table, and gave a small nod. Better morning, he said. Yes, sir, Mark replied. Frank looked at him for a moment, then smiled, small but real. Good. Just that, but it carried weight. By late morning, it was time to go. I stood near the front door with my bag. Jenna hugged me longer this time, and I returned it without hesitation. Come back for the wedding, she said. I will. Mark stepped forward, a brief pause, and then he held out his hand. I took it. Drive safe, he said. I will. Then after a beat, and thank you. For what? For not shutting me out, he said, when you had every reason to. I nodded once. You gave me a reason not to. That seemed to settle in him. Frank walked me to the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, he said, You did more last night than you think. I just told the truth, I said. That's usually enough, he replied. He looked at me a moment longer. Take care of yourself. I will. I got in my car and sat with the engine off for a moment. Same seat as the night before, same steering wheel, same street, but not the same feeling. The house behind me wasn't just a place I'd pass through. It was somewhere I could come back to. I turned the key. As I pulled away, I glanced once in the mirror. Mark and Jenna stood in the doorway. Frank just behind them. 3 generations, 3 different lives, all of them changed just a little by one dinner. I don't think about the nickname much anymore. Mad Dog was never something I carried with pride. It was something I carried because I had to. But that night reminded me of something I'd almost let myself forget. People don't need to understand everything you've been through. They just need to meet you with respect when they realize they don't. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they learn. And so do you.